It's exciting to welcome you to our second season of the January series in July. My name is Michael Wiltskett, the director of the series. As we left our series in January, I challenged us to continue being curious. The gift of curiosity is that it can always be there, and summer sometimes allows us to be even more curious. Travel or a change of routine allows us to experience new perspectives and ideas. The January series is grateful to our underwriters and supporters for enabling us to share 3 more opportunities to be curious. Today, we are joined by Professor Jennifer Holberg, Professor of English, whose new book, Nourishing Narratives, is the topic for today. Reviewers have described her book as compelling, approachable, smart, observant, and compassionate. Jennifer's deep smile and kind intentionality make our campus a better place. We are excited to share this conversation with you with campus pastor, Reverend Dr. Mary Hulst, a wonderful friend of the January series. Enjoy week 1 of the January series in July.
Well, Jennifer, I loved your book, as you can tell from my many notations. It was simply a delight to read.
Well, thanks, Mary.
So thank you for writing it.
Yeah.
For those of you who don't know, today we're talking about nourishing narratives, the power of story to shape our faith. And there has never been a subtitle that was more accurate, I don't think.
Yeah, right.
So good. So talk about where this book came from.
Right. Well, thanks, Mary. I'm so honored to get to be here today and to talk with you, but also to be part of the long and really noble, distinguished history of the January series. So just so honored to be here today. But the book grew out of a couple of different places. So if for those of you who will read it, it really does grow out of my teaching. I've just finished my 25th year at Calvin. And I love our students and I love interacting with our students. So the book is a lot. A couple of my students have actually read it now and said, it's like being in your class, which I kind of hoped for. Yeah. I teach a lot of gen ed, a lot of core literature, a lot of freshman 101. And I actually love teaching that student. I love the student who's going to be an engineer or a nurse or a business person. And what I really want them to think about is what that subtitle is saying, is how are the stories that we are bombarded with from our families, from our culture, from our churches, from ourselves, the stories we sort of somehow internalize, how are those stories that we interpret well? Because I think there's a lot of books that tell you, oh, read the classics and become a better person, or 50 Days with Shakespeare. And those really can be really useful because, classic literature is there for a reason. But I think the more interesting thing is to think about how we interpret and how we interpret well. And so often we don't, or we get trapped in a story. And so the subtitle, I think, is interesting because the power of story to shape our faith. Shape is not positive or negative. It can be both. And so what I want readers to think about is, what are the stories that are sort of driving you along? Mm-hmm. And are those ones that are going to nourish you, or are those ones that are a little bit more toxic? And I think we need to think about that at every level. Our personal level, our relational level, our church levels. Are we being culturally Christian? Are we responding to things culturally, or are we actually using a hermeneutic, an interpretive mode that is useful? So out of my classes, so there's a lot of poetry in there. My own father read it and said, I didn't really think I wouldn't have said I was a big poetry guy, but by the end, I was seeing really how the poetry was really shaping, was really doing some things. So that I teach a lot. And we have a thing here at Calvin called the Calvin Academy of Lifelong Learning Call. So I do a lot of public teaching, Sunday schools. And then for many years, I have been a blogger with the Reformed Journal. And so some seeds of the book really came out of those blogs. And over the years, people would say, are you ever doing anything with those blogs? And my answer was typically no. And then a young woman who worked for me at the Center for Faith and Writing kept saying to me, I think there's something there. You really need to. And she said, I am convinced of this, and I'm going to drive you crazy until you do something. And so she did.
Bless her heart.
Bless her heart. And really encouraged me. And then I was visiting Catherine Patterson, the children's writer, who's a friend of mine. And she has recently, in recent years, written kind of a memoir of her life, but really it's more stories. And when I left, she said, it's time for you to tell your own stories. It's time for you to do that. And between Natalie, who worked with me, and Catherine, I thought, okay.
When Catherine Patterson says,
it's true.
You should write a book.
It's true.
You really do have to listen.
And I will say she kept texting me the whole time, kind of like Natalie. I had these two cheerleaders saying, no, keep doing it. And I do think that that's another takeaway, I think, for people is, what is your story? In the opening part of the book, I talk about how I feel like a lot of us, maybe who grew up in the church, feel like we're lacking a story or
a big conversion story.
Right.
Yep.
We have boring testimony syndrome, I call it. And that's really an interpretive problem, though. That's saying that there are some stories that count, some stories where we think God is really working, but not really over here in our boring good girl life. But of course, saying that I have a boring good girl life implies somehow I'm not a sinner,
right.
I'm not in need of God's grace, right? So that's already a story that's shaping my self-perception,
right,
shaping my need for God, all of those kinds of things. So a long answer, because it was a lot of different streams that kind of got me to this point. And it's why I think people should always read the acknowledgments, because you sort of understand how any creative project. So right now we're in a room with several cameramen, and right, all of these things take many hands, and I think that's another story I'd like us to think more about. So,
I love that.
Yeah,
your own story kind of took many hands. So talk about your own boring testimony, which actually isn't so boring.
Yeah,
but talk about your life and faith, and then how you weave that in to your teaching.
Right. So I grew up in a military family. My father was a career officer, so I moved 9 times. I'm not really from anywhere, and yet I talk about in the book how the church really is a home, because everywhere we went, we immediately were involved, typically in the base chapel, but occasionally we went, especially when I was in high school, we went to a off-base chapel, but I always lived on the base except for twice. So very much sort of steeped in that culture, but also steeped in the, if you're going to do something, you better do it. You should get involved. A lot of the characteristics that a lot of third culture kids or military kids have. But that faith was a really important home. And it was a very important kind of community that there were always people there that you immediately knew, that you immediately, connected with, and also you're much more aware of sort of life and death kinds of things. I mean, people go off, and my father's a Vietnam veteran. So I grew up in sort of the 70s and 80s with men who had mostly been in Vietnam, but some who had been in Korea or World War II. So a really different sense of the world. I also lived abroad about half of my school years. And I think that gives you a very different sense of yourself as an American, a very different sense of history of the world. When you turn on the news, your country isn't the first story on the news, right? And that gives you a sensibility about that. I also think, though, it gives you a way of thinking about being more fearless, because I think you can go a couple of different ways, but I think my parents were always big on wherever we were going, before we would go, we spent a lot of time researching the place, and my parents would be very excited with us about, oh, this is all the things we're going to get to do, rather than we have to leave this other place, but we're going to something else. We're going to meet all these great new people. Here's all the cool things that have happened in that country or in that part of America even. But also, like, once you're there, get involved, because you may not be there that long. So do you want to run for student body office? You should do that. Do you want to make friends? Do that. And I think that has shaped a lot of who I am as a person, in terms of thinking about wherever I go. Yeah, I'm not from there, but that's okay, right? How am I going to be part of that community? And how do I learn about the best about those folks, whoever it is I live with?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think there's more there, but I'll stop.
No, that's lovely. And I think one of the great themes in the book is it nurtures and pushes us toward our own self-reflection. Like, what have I been telling myself about my story? And where is God active in my story? And I think the fact that you say, at first glance, my own testimony is kind of what it is. But then you go deeper and you're like, no, look at all the ways in which God cared for me, which I think is really delightful.
And that was a real testimony of my parents. My mother would talk about when my father went to Vietnam, how she would pray one of the Psalms every single day, and how she would think about, God's providence, God's protection. And I just was cleaning out my father's house, and I came across a speech she had given, and she was talking about details about, like, how often he was traveled, and I remember that he was gone as a child, but when he was present, he was so present that in my own recollection of that period, he was not gone as much. And then I'm reading this thinking, he was gone a lot. And she did a great job really thinking about, and talks about in the speech, kind of what she did to kind of, still let us have a family life and a church life, and that it wasn't so disruptive. Whereas as I'm looking at it as an adult, I think, oh goodness, he was gone quite a bit, which I knew intellectually. But yeah, and the stories then we tell about what our family life is like or whatever. And I think that's good too, to test it. We have siblings, and I tried to talk to them about, okay, that's pretty much right.
Am I remembering this?
Am I remembering this right? Because of course they have different experiences. But yes, I do think this return back to where has God been active in our lives. Frederick Buechner, who I think is influential on a whole lot of us. But when he says, listen to your life and think about all of those moments and all of these small moments. And I think one of the things I hope the book encourages people is that I think a life of long faithfulness is a really important and good story too. And so God works in a lot of ways, very dramatic ways, and I don't want that to ever be dismissed as, that's not legit because that's too flashy. No, there are definitely the flashy stories, but there's so many people that I think, how is God with you in all these small moments, and maybe just hidden moments that most people haven't seen, but that you struggled with, or through the dark night of the soul, or the many dark nights of the soul, or just trying to be kind and generous, or build a thing. Having been in an institution now for 25 years, when people retire now, I mean, I've known them, and I think about all the committees we were in together, and all of those things that there's really never going to be a record of, and yet they're so important to the way in which a place is built, a church is built, a business is built, a college is built. How do we pay attention to that and then act accordingly too, in gratitude, and in thinking about the ways that wow, God was there, and helping you pay attention.
Yeah. What have you observed and amended and edited and changed in your own teaching? So over 25 years, you also have been editor of a journal about pedagogy in the classroom. And so talk about how your teaching is always changing.
Yeah, I am not someone who ever thinks it was good enough. So at the end of every class, I'm always thinking, okay, so what will I do next time? Or how could I have helped them engage better? I think I've probably, and I think most sort of senior, I was about to say elderly, but people who've been in the profession a long time.
You are far from elderly,
Yes, I know,
my friend.
But, my first year at Calvin, when I was 30, someone wrote on my evaluations, "Do not try to relate to me. You are old." And I thought, okay,
Thanks.
Not trying to relate and also not old. But no, I think one of the things I try to think about is what students are already bringing into the class. And instead of thinking about deficiencies or what they don't know, which I always tell students, it's really easy for me to write a test that you can't pass.
Right.
But that's not that interesting to me.
Right.
Right. I want you to be able to show off what you do know. And so what I want to think about is what are they already interested in, good at, but maybe they don't realize they are.
Yes.
So for me, teaching is less about content delivery. I hope you get some content, but I also know that I was about to say 5 years from now, but even next year, they probably won't remember the dates of the Victorian period. Hopefully they'll remember it was vaguely the 19th century. But more importantly, have they learned interpretive skills? And sometimes that takes it, poetry is not something people just get. Literature is not just something people get. And in fact, they often are anxious about it, uncomfortable. They're afraid that someone else got the secret ring that they didn't get, right? Is the flower Jesus? Or is it, what is it? When it blooms, is it just blooming? Is there meanings? I don't know. And, and they're used to being told they're wrong. But so much of what we're engaging in is storied. So I want them to leave feeling confident in their own voice. Because when they are in a corporate situation, if they're, at their church or whatever, I want them to be able to feel like they have a voice. So we practice that a lot. I call on people and we have a lot of class discussions and we try to think about how to have good conversation, which I think our society really needs a lot of practice in.
Yes.
But then also, what is the story that's being told here and how are we responding? Is this a good story? Is this a bad story? Is this somewhere in between? Where does this come from? And so I think I've probably slowed down a little bit. I don't maybe cover as much as I used to. So I used to assign like 15 poems for a class, knowing that I was probably only going to cover 3. But I thought, but at least you should read the other ones. And now I'll maybe assign like 7, knowing I'm still going to do 3 or 4, but connecting those more.
Yeah.
And really, but going deep with them in having them leave feeling confident that they know how to interpret. I'm also probably, by this point, and I even say this to students on the first day, I've done it such a long time, you won't be the first person to have whatever problem it is. So don't worry about it. Come in, let's chat. Like my job really is to get you through. It's not for you to come and find out what a poem means, because that's boring. Like you writing down what I think a poem means, that does nothing for you.
Yep.
I really want you to engage. And I think every year I feel like I'm more and more pastoral. I spend a lot more time talking about just, the ways in which I hope literature is going to help give them. There was a man in our department in the 50s who wrote a book called Testament of Vision. And in it he says, literature should give us more to be faithful with. And I think if you leave my class with a kind of way to interact with language, with words, with story, and it's given you more to be faithful with, I think I've done my job.
Yeah.
And do you know everything else? That's fine. But when you listen to a sermon, are you a better listener? Are you a better interpreter? Are you thinking about the fact that you say you believe one thing, but you love this kind of TV show that is exactly the opposite? And you can maybe, how are you going to reconcile those if you are? Are you thinking, it's just not really, no, I don't think I'm going to believe that. That does not seem right. Yeah. So all of those things, I think that's kind of what I'm hoping to happen in whatever classroom I'm in, even when it's with adults or Sunday schools or whatever. Do you feel like you're stronger now to do this work? Did I give you the tools?
Yes. I love that.
Yeah.
One of the exercises you describe in the book is this looking. And you spend a couple of weeks teaching them how to look and observe.
Yeah.
Talk about the origins of that idea and how it actually, how students think, what do they think? Like, this is a lit class and you want me to look at art? I'm not.
Yeah. So that was actually for writing for my freshman composition class. And I decided to think that year. So I'm always trying to change it up because people often come out of high school not feeling very confident in their writing, or just bored, or they don't want to write about all of the typical things. So I try to change it up a little bit. And I've moved to this, it's a whole movement called slow looking, and there's a number of books about it. But it's really to try to, again, help make you more attentive and to pay attention. And I think we live in a world where even my own reading, you know, it's so tempting to scroll. And I mean, I teach 19th century literature, which is very convoluted, and, you know, you have to kind of, but meanwhile, you're looking at your phone every 5 seconds.
Right.
And so one of the things I talk to my literature students about is, you know, turning your phone off for half an hour, flipping it over at least, just so that you start to build habits of attention, because I think that's one of the things in college that people don't necessarily think a lot about, is the way in which inattentiveness really takes them longer to do their homework. They aren't processing it as well. And we just don't have as meditative spaces anymore, even in our churches, right? Everything's very like move, right? And so slow looking was really to say, as a writer, I want you to pay attention to lots of things, but you need to have space to do it. And so one of the things we did was I made them go out in our nature preserve, and they had to basically describe things from, and they could use their phones as well, but they were supposed to take a picture of something like super close up at a different distance, lying down on the ground, you know, just to get a sense of all of the ways that those different ways of seeing even give you something new, even if it's the exact same object. And what does that show you? And then how in your writing would that also work out? We started with each other's pictures. So they had introduced themselves, but then they had to put up the picture that is
their ID
picture. And that was hilarious, right? Because the difference between the two, and what would we think of them if we saw that picture as opposed to when we saw them, and just trying to think a lot about that. I had them walk around the campus, and when they came back, they'd each walk the same route, but they had to talk about what they had noticed. And it was fascinating because one guy noticed like every poster for, you know, like chapel. And somebody else was like, they were postering. And so that was important too, as we thought about interpretation, and what, it wasn't that anyone was wrong, but it was like, what is everyone bringing to it? And they started realizing what they already started. So back to what I was saying before about what do they already know how to do? I think they already are noticing things. So then how does that lead to research interest? To vocation, there's all kinds of things that you're already noticing, but maybe you aren't noticing that you're noticing.
Yes.
And so, and I made them go look at art, and I made them look at a certain number, and then we did timed exercises to see just how long our attention would go. And we realized that sometimes, you know, that was too long. But that how things change. So I make them stop and say, after 3 minutes, what have you noticed? After 7 minutes, what have you noticed? After, right? And at what point do you lose attention? That's important too. So just a lot of exercises to start getting them thinking about what they're already doing, where they have, where they could do better. Maybe they're not real good at looking at things up close. And why is that? Or what makes them uncomfortable. Like, it made them real uncomfortable to have to stand quietly and look at a painting for a timed period. You would think that wouldn't be a problem, but it was. They were like, can we go now? Can I look at right? Because we're not really a very settled.
Yes.
So it was partly teaching a lot of different things like that in order to help them, think about what they wanted to write about.
One of the things I admire about you and other good teachers is that there is a humility to say, I don't know everything I need to know about teaching. And I think your practice with these students about looking was like, I want to try this and see if it works.
Right.
And there's an experimental, this could totally fail.
Yep.
So how as a teacher, and as we watch the rising generations come in who have different needs, how do you as a teacher continue to learn about the rising generations, learn about your field, think about how the faith aspect comes in?
Right.
What is the ongoing work of a teacher?
Yeah, I think that's such a great question. I do try to keep up. One of the things I try to do is I try to go to things they're in. So at the very beginning, I've actually started to, I've always had a practice where I, make them introduce themselves or say things that are important to them. But I've gotten to the point now where I've started like sending them a pre-survey just to tell me a little bit about themselves or tell me about things they'd like me to know in terms of, even how they want to behave in the class or needs they have or things like that are harder to maybe say face-to-face. But I also think, and I talk about this in the last part of the book, I think it's really important to never fall into kids these days.
Yeah.
Kids these days.
Kids these days.
They're so blah, blah, blah. And again, it goes back to what I was saying earlier about deficiencies or not. And I really always think, so it was funny, a year or so ago, or I guess more than that, but a couple of years ago, I went to a conference in England for Middlemarch, which is my favorite novel. George Eliot, it was her 200th birthday. And so they had a big international conference. And so I was presenting on Middlemarch. And I went back and I found this book from the Modern Language Association on teaching Middlemarch. And I was just flipping through it. And this very distinguished scholar was writing about kids these days and how terrible, they were and how they didn't know anything and they are distracted by their technology. Well, it was published in 1990, which was the year I graduated from college. And I was the kids these days.
Yep.
Right? Who didn't understand Middlemarch and who were terrible and blah, blah, blah. And I think such has it ever been. And so I think if you continue to always think, oh, kids these days, you miss out on how actually wonderful they are.
That's right.
And what they are bringing. I think it's important to listen to them. So I talk in the book about how that verse, one generation will testify to the other. And I always, when I was younger, always heard that as old people will speak to us. And that was important. Like I was also a history major. I thought it was really important to learn from your elders. I think the church is amazing because it's one of the only multi-generational spaces that is left. But I always saw it one way. And the longer I teach, the more I think, no, it's about listening to that generation too. And I say to students at the beginning of every semester, if I don't learn from you this semester, I won't have done my job. Right?
Yes.
This literature speaks to us because it needs to continue to speak to us.
Right.
And you're going to notice things that I will never notice. This goes back to like, what do we notice and how we need, and as Reformed people, we really don't believe in top-down interpretation. We believe that we learn from each other. We believe that the whole history of the church, that we study, the 2,000 years of church interpretation, because there's still things to be learned from people in the Middle Ages. And there's still things to be learned from people who are 19 years old right now. And that the testimony of God is so amazing because it continues to live in every generation. And so in class, when I say we're going to have a discussion, that means I'm not going to just say, here, this poet means blah, write it down, give it back to me in 2 weeks. No, what do you think it means? What are you seeing? What are you noticing? And yes, I do, as a sort of more advanced learner, bring some more things to sort of maybe help or more context. But I think that if we aren't doing the other, we're really missing out. So I want to try to go to their things, understand what they're interested in. My intro question is about their music, right? So my intro is often, what's your walk-up song? What's your hype song?
That's a great
If we
question.
had one song, if we had one question to like get to know you, what is it? And they'll tell you all kinds of interesting stuff.
Yep.
And then I have a little dialogue with each of them as they say it. And so I want to know who they are, and I want to understand, like, and I want to help them connect what they're doing in engineering or what they're doing to what I'm trying to do. And that we really do have a shared mission here, and we have a shared identity as brothers and sisters in Christ. So I'm not their mother in Christ. I'm their sibling.
Right.
Right?
That's right.
And so they can also teach me things. So I think it's important I try to be pretty open in class. I don't think it should go one way or the other. Like it's not very fair when students are the only ones who have to share, but you never do. Right? That's a power move.
Yes.
And so I try to be as open with them as I ask them to be with me, within appropriate professional boundaries, right, for them and me. But I also just want them to know, too, that they're beloved. And I think when you asked me earlier what has changed, I do think that I'm much more out there, if you will, in really just wanting that to be a goal of the class. Like, I want you to know that, whatever else, God loves you, and you will never be more beloved than this right now.
That's right.
And that's just so important, I think, that someone has said that to them. I teach a poem by Hopkins that I talk about in the book. And at the end, he gets very wound up that the world is a burning trash heap, literally.
Yes.
Like he thinks, he's like, oh my gosh, and a human being never makes a mark that's strong enough to survive, and eventually no one remembers. And he gets, whoa, and finally in the middle of the poem, he says, enough, the resurrection. And he talks about how because of the resurrection and the promise of that even if it is a burning trash heap, which, okay, let's say it is, it doesn't matter, because what's happening with the fire is it's burning everything away. And that right now I'm a jack, I'm a joke, I'm a shard, I'm all this trashy stuff.
Yep.
But I'm already right now immortal diamond. And then he says, and when all of this goes, I'll still be immortal diamond. And so I say to them, not only do I want that to be the name of my rock band,
yes,
which would be amazing,
yes,
but remember today, you are an immortal diamond. You are precious, you are beloved, right? And you're also all this trashy stuff too. Yeah, sure. We believe in sin, unreformed, sure.
Yep.
But you're already an immortal diamond. And that becomes kind of the theme for the class. That happens about 5 weeks in. And after that, they always say to me, and I would say, remember, immortal diamonds. And I think I might not have been quite that exuberant on that point earlier in my teaching. But now I think if that's the one thing you remember from my class, I'm okay with that.
Amen.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a gift. Your book, you also talk about loss and how there are so many stories that talk about how we as Christians engage with, respond to, deal with loss. You had a significant loss as a young adult when your mom passed, and you talk about going to the funeral home, and the funeral director is like, well, you want to do it 2 for a year? You want to buy the plot for both of you? And
for my dad
and your mom and your dad. And you're like, really? Do I need to confront both parents' deaths at the same time? So talk about how old you were. Talk about what you've seen in your own process of grief around that over the years, and how stories have impacted that.
So my mother was this sort of force of nature.
Not surprised.
Yeah, well,
apple and tree.
Definitely was somebody who, very much was always doing stuff. And I mean, my mother died of a brain aneurysm when I was 30. I had just come to Calvin. It was my very first year at Calvin. So really didn't know too many people. I mean, I knew my colleagues, but, had not yet kind of established myself in the community. She lived in New Mexico, so a long way away, not really near my dad. My siblings also lived similarly far away. And it was just a shock. She was only 55, and she was just so present that to have her just sort of do that was a shock. But what was interesting about that was, the day she died, she had this very large women's Bible study that she taught. And her lesson the day she died was on God's providence. Mm. And she shared with the women in her Bible study the different times in her life, partly what I shared earlier about like when my dad was in Vietnam, but all of his traveling and the constant moving and, all of the things that she experienced as a military spouse. And she just said, and I just have been reminded again and again of God's care for me. Mm. And then she said, at the end of the Bible study, whatever happens today, I want you all to put your weight down on the goodness of God. Mm. Right? And then she died that afternoon. And at the funeral, there were more women from that Bible study who I didn't really know. Right. I kept saying to my dad, "Who is this lady?" And he was like, "I think she's in Mom's Bible study." That would come up and say, Sally preached her funeral sermon. Mm. And that was a real testimony to us, right? Today, put your weight down. She was very convinced of it. She would always say to us, she was very effusive, and she would always, oh, I love you. And we'd be like, yeah, Mother, it's fine. Like, please, like, calm down. But she would always respond to that by saying, I don't want you to have any doubts. Mm-hmm. I don't want you to have any doubts. And when we all came together for her funeral, my siblings and I were talking to each other, and we said to each other, well, we don't have any doubts. And that to me is a great gift. Yes. And it's one of the things I talk to my students about, to my friends about, is do people have doubts about how you feel about them? Because we often are so, like it's cool, like, hey, we're good, right? Right. And people really do need that affirmation. Mm-hmm. And so T.S. Eliot talks in The Wasteland about the way we know we're really lived is that we have experienced the awful daring of a moment's surrender. Mm. Right? But that awful daring part, it is hard to be emotionally vulnerable. Yes. To be out there, to have not people say, oh, you're so weird, or like, stop, or you're too much. Too much. Think about how often people are put down by being told they're too much. Mm-hmm. But you know what? That's the abundant life. That's right. And to have the bravery to do that. And so I think after my mother died, I really was probably a little bit more like, I'm very intellectual, very much about, being smart and being capable. And I became less worried about telling people how I felt and sort of being brave enough to own that. Mm-hmm. And to say things like what I say to students, right? You're beloved. Yeah. In the past, I would have said, you're smart, you're doing great, whatever. But now I say to them, you're beloved. Mm-hmm. Try to live into that belovedness, because I really experienced that in my own family. Yeah. And so many people don't. That's right. Right? Or they feel judged in the world in some way because of their size or their whatever it is. Yep. Every day, one of the stories we get told is, you're not enough. Yep. You're lacking. If you just did this, too bad you didn't do this. Yep. Right? And I just think that the Christian story is so much richer than that. Right. That God loves us as we are. And that's not to say that we're not supposed to be sanctified or any of that, but I just think that kind of anxiety about, oh, someone's judging me, nope. Right. And so I think that her testimony was really, to me, to be out there, to be too much, because when she died, what people remembered about her was her too muchness, right? Like at my graduation party, she made 13, she and her friends we ended up with 13 cakes. Now, I'm not sure she meant there to be 13, but we ended up, and I thought, yeah, par for the course, right? But someone came up to me at her funeral and said, Jennifer, I still remember those 13 cakes. That was so great. That was so fun. Sally, if you came to her house, we had this family friend, a single minister. My parents had known him in Japan when we moved to New Mexico. He would just show up. Like my mother had this open door policy, and he would just show up on a Sunday afternoon. And if we were done eating, I mean, sometimes he'd eat the leftovers, but my mother would always say, well, Chet, honey, what can I make for you? And I would think, Chet, honey, can eat the leftovers. And one time I said something to her about it, like, really, I can't believe that sometimes you make him new food. And she was like, why? She was like, that's a nice thing for him. You know, it doesn't. And she was like, and I enjoy it. And right. And if it had been a thing, right. But you know, she offered and she enjoyed doing it, and why not? Right. And so often we're keeping score. Right. And I think it's interesting in Corinthians where it talks about, you know, love keeps no record of wrongs. But I think some of us Christians, we keep record of rights too.
Yes, we do.
Right?
Yes,
and it's
we
like,
do.
I did this for you, I did this for you, what have you done for me?
Yep.
Well, that's actually not, I mean, that kind of accounting system can get real ugly and get real resentful and get real like, well, I'm amazing. What is happening here? Right? And so I think there's just a lot of lessons, but I think that go ahead and be out there, be yourself, be unapologetic about the things that are important to you, and that includes people. Yeah.
Your last chapter is kind of an ode to Christian teaching.
Yep.
If you were to give advice to new faculty, what would you tell them?
Well, I would tell them what I do tell them, which is I think often new teachers, especially people who haven't taught a lot, they get examples of people who are successful. So they'll see someone like me who is very, you know, I'm out there, I tell jokes, very exuberant in the classroom. We're going like this. And that is not them, but they think that's what you got to do to be a successful teacher, and they really worry about that. So I always say to people, be who you are.
Yes.
Because every personality can be an amazing teacher.
Yes.
Students really respect authenticity above all else. Students want there to be good structure, right? Predictability. Stuff isn't just due whenever, or you constantly switch deadlines or things like that. So be predictable. Be fair, right? Be transparent about what you're doing. So I'm asking you to do this because of this that I want you to accomplish. I think students don't sometimes understand, like, why am I writing this paper? So I think trying to be transparent and clear with them about what you're hoping they get out of it, transparent and clear about how you are going to be assessing them, not defensive when they want to come and ask about their grade. You should be able to defend your grades and explain them. If you can't, you probably need to think about that. But then mostly to be who you are in the classroom and make it work for you. Because I have good friends who are introverted, quiet, but just wonderful teachers because they are who they are in the classroom. And if you want students to be who they are, you need to be that as well. So I think inhabiting yourself, for good and for ill, like sometimes you have to think, you know, I'm not good at this. So what is it that I need to do to improve there? That's right.
Yep.
And you know, there's a big debate among professors about whether they read their evaluations or not. I always do, and because I think even as they have some issues, I mean, in terms of how they can be used, I do think it's interesting to understand what students are getting, what they're not. I encourage my own faculty to do more kinds of evaluative things, figure out. I do a lot of conferencing because I want to know from students what is actually serving them. Because what served me as a student a long time ago in the 80s may not be serving them. Maybe learning differently than I would learn. And I think you can't expect that students are you. And that's a real problem that new faculty have, is they remember themselves as students, and so they teach to that. The problem is there's actually a whole book about this where the guy said, professors should never pretend they were like the normal student, because that they became professors. Right. So what is it? How are you reaching people who are maybe not you, who don't love your subject, who don't have strengths in this? I think the pandemic was great for that because it made us all have to learn new stuff as professors. we were having to scramble to learn technology, and you heard a lot of faculty saying, oh man, it's taken me a long time, or I'm just not getting it, or the directions aren't clear. Bingo. So now let's think about how that might relate to how we ourselves present our own materials and how long it's taking a new learner to learn your thing. I mean, I've been teaching this poem for 30 years, right? Yeah, I do know it, but it might take them a minute to work through it.
Yep.
Right. And I think that kind of patience and sort of relating to them as learners. Yeah. So I think it's good for us to continue to be learners too. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If a new faculty had no experience with Christian Ed, hadn't had it as a student, right, didn't know anything about it, was kind of scared of it, deep believer, which is why they're invited to teach at Calvin, what suggestions would you make to them for how to integrate faith into the classroom?
Yeah, well, and that was me. I mean, I went to public school, I went to public universities, and so I had never been at a Christian college when I came to Calvin. I think what I love about Christian education above everything else is we teach the whole person. There's nothing off limits. So as we think about engaging a topic, we can think about the spirituality of it. We should. And so I think to approach your discipline in that kind of fullness, to approach your students in that fullness, that in literature, we're going to talk about the faith approach here, or the not faith approach. I mean, I just finished teaching a class on the modernists, many of them active atheists. So what does that look like in a text? How does this help me think about the way I'm approaching the world? Here's people telling me what the world looks like to them without God. All right, let's take that seriously and think about what my own sense would be back to that. And I also think that it's about a community of teachers. I love that. My department has a strong tradition of teaching, and I think the way to learn how to be better is to talk to other people who do it, and to understand kind of what they do, and to have a mentor and to have all those kinds of things that help you understand how to be in a community. And I also think to continue to be a theological learner. The reason I chose to come to Calvin is I really loved the Reformed engagement with culture. And I felt that were I to go to a different Christian college, which I had an opportunity to do, where you could be sort of lots of different things, which in some ways was much more in accord with my own upbringing, I liked that we all had theological presuppositions that we'd settled, that we have a view of the creation, that we have a view of the goodness of creation, that we have a view of the human person, that there are some things that and if you haven't been in a Christian college and you haven't thought theologically very much about your discipline or about, it's really good to continue to be a learner, and to think about all the ways that theology is going to enrich the kinds of intellectual conversations you're going to have, and that you're joining a community that's been engaged in that conversation for a long time that would like you to join. So what can your voice add to that, but also what can you learn from these folks that have been thinking about it for a long time?
Mm-hmm. I love that. Is there anything you thought I would ask that I haven't asked that you would like to answer? You're like, I've got a great answer.
No. I'm this book is interesting because it's a bit of a hybrid. Mm-hmm. It's not straight up literary criticism. It's not someone said, oh, there's so many stories about you, but it's not a memoir, which it isn't. And I wanted to write a book that, first of all, was very much for the common reader. That's, it's not, even though it's coming out through an IVP, University Press, academic, it's really meant for everyday people. And it's written in this kind of hybrid way that uses stories to help you understand stories. So it's a lot more of an implicit book as opposed to do this, do this, do this. And so that's been interesting how people have, what they get out of it, which story they connect to, which part. And I think, I just think that the genre itself is a different kind of genre. So It's interesting to me how people have received it because it's a different read. I hope it's supposed to be sort of in chunks so you can like pick it up and put it down. So if you don't have a lot of time, but it's really mostly to help you connect with your own story or with stories you've thought about. So it's fascinating to me, Mary, what you decided to engage with. So thank you so much.
Oh, it's been a delight. Thank you for writing it. And we'll conclude with a quote from her grandma who says, always keep a book in your purse.
Always keep a book in your purse, or maybe two.
Or backpack or satchel.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you, Jennifer.